Have you ever had a moment where the world you knew cracks right down the middle and you're forced to see everything and everyone for what they truly are? I had a moment like that. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm, not an earthquake or a storm. It was quiet. It happened at a dinner table, surrounded by the people I was supposed to trust most in the world, under the soft glow of a chandelier my grandfather had bought 60 years earlier. For 5 years, the sound of that quiet crack has been the engine driving my life. Next week, I fly back home. Not to mend the crack, but to own both sides of the chasm. This isn't a story about forgiveness. It's a story about a debt being paid in full. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been cast aside by the people who were supposed to lift you up, then stick around. You're going to want to hear how this ends. The air in the private jet is cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the humid, salt-kissed breeze of Lisbon I left behind this morning. Below me, the lights of my hometown are beginning to glitter in the dusk, a familiar constellation of streets and buildings I once knew better than the back of my own hand. It's been 5 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that I'm counting. Every one of those days was a brick, and I used them to build an empire they never saw coming. They thought I was on a little adventure, as my father so condescendingly put it in his last email 3 years ago. They imagined me struggling, probably living in some tiny apartment, barely scraping by, dreaming of the day I could come crawling back and beg for a handout. The prodigal son, returning with his tail between his legs. They wanted me to crawl. Instead, I'm flying, and I'm not coming back for a fatted calf. I'm coming for the whole farm. The auction is next Tuesday at 10 a.m. The court-appointed liquidator will stand at a podium in a bland, soulless conference room and sell off the last remaining assets of Moretti Global Logistics, the company my grandfather founded. My father ran into the ground and I was supposed to inherit. My family will be there, their faces a mask of strained dignity, trying to pretend this is just a temporary setback, a strategic restructuring. They'll have scraped together every last cent, called in every favor to try and buy back the hollowed-out shell of their legacy. They have no idea who the primary bidder is. They don't know that the anonymous, aggressive European firm that has been circling their carcass for months is mine. Navigar Imports, the company I built from nothing in a country they couldn't even be bothered to find on a map, is about to swallow Moretti Global whole. They wanted me to crawl back to the ground they stood on. Instead, I'm coming to buy it from under their feet. The moment it all broke was a Thursday. I remember the starched collar of my shirt chafing my neck, the oppressive weight of another 80-hour week settling on my shoulders. I was the chief operating officer of Moretti Global. I'd held the position for 6 years, but I'd been working in the company since I was a boy, sweeping warehouse floors for my grandfather. He was a tough, brilliant man who saw logistics as a form of art. He taught me that every shipment, every truck, every single box was a promise. "We don't just move cargo, Nico," he'd say, his voice thick with an Italian accent he never quite lost. "We move trust." I lived by that creed. I'd spent my entire adult life learning every facet of the business, from customs law to freight futures. I designed the inventory management system they still used, a system that had saved them millions. I personally negotiated the contracts that kept them afloat through 2 recessions. My father, Dominic, had always been the face of the company, the glad-handing, back-slapping salesman, while I was the engine, hidden away in the belly of the ship, making sure it actually moved. The CEO position was the unspoken promise, the culmination of my life's work. My father was turning 70. His retirement was the talk of the industry. And it was my time. Everyone knew it. The employees, the clients, even our competitors. So when my mother Isabella called and said my father was making a special announcement at a family dinner, I felt a quiet sense of arrival. This was it. The dining room was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and my mother's expensive perfume. My father stood at the head of the table, a glass of Brunello in his hand, a magnanimous, kingly smile on his face. My mother beamed at him, her eyes glittering, and my sister Clara sat next to her husband, Julian. Julian, the perpetual outsider, the charming real estate developer who had married into the family and always seemed faintly amused by the dirty work of logistics. He was all flashy suits and expensive watches, a man who measured success in square footage and schmoozing, not in tonnage and delivery times. I'd never liked him, but Clara adored him. She saw his superficial ambition as a sign of greatness, a welcome contrast to what she called my dusty obsession with the family business. My father cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "As you all know," he began, his voice booming with practiced authority, "I have dedicated my life to this company, but the time has come for a new generation to take the helm, a generation with the vision to steer Moretti Global into the future." He paused, and his eyes met mine for a fleeting second. I felt a swell of pride, of gratitude. I straightened my tie, ready to stand, to accept the mantle. "The board and I have had many long discussions," he continued, turning his gaze away from me. We need a leader who is not just an operator, but a true rainmaker. Someone with fresh ideas, someone from outside our world who can see the opportunities we're too close to notice. My stomach went cold. Outside our world. What was he talking about? And then he smiled, a broad, triumphant grin, and placed his hand on Julian's shoulder. And that is why I am thrilled to announce that the new CEO of Moretti Global Logistics will be my son-in-law, Julian. The world didn't just crack, it shattered. The sound of my mother's and sister's ecstatic applause was like shattering glass in my ears. Julian stood up, a picture of false modesty, patting my father on the back. "Dominic, I'm humbled. I won't let you down. I won't let any of you down." His eyes slid over to me, and for a split second the mask dropped. I saw it, a flicker of smug reptilian triumph. He had won. He had played a game I didn't even know we were in. I looked at my sister Clara. She was beaming, tears of joy in her eyes as she hugged her husband. She wouldn't even look at me, not once. She had known. They had all known. This wasn't a decision. It was a coronation they had all planned behind my back. I looked at my father. He was avoiding my gaze now, busying himself with pouring more wine. The king had named his successor, and the inconvenient workhorse son was expected to just fall in line. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, the ghosts of my grandfather, of every long-serving employee, of every promise I'd ever been made. The silence from my end of the table was becoming deafening. Finally, my father looked at me, his expression hardening. "Nico," he said, his voice no longer warm but clipped and final. "I expect you to support Julian. Show him the ropes. Your operational expertise will be invaluable to him. Show him the ropes." The words were a slap in the face. I was being demoted from heir apparent to glorified tour guide for the man who had stolen my birthright. I didn't say a word. I simply stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. The sound was unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense room. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. I looked at each of them, my beaming mother, my triumphant sister, my smirking brother-in-law, and finally my father, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life trying to earn. "Congratulations," I said, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth. And then I turned and walked out. I didn't just walk out of the dining room. I walked out of their lives. That night I went back to my apartment and booked a one-way ticket to Lisbon. When they found out 2 days later that I was packing my bags, the sneering began. "A little adventure?" Clara had scoffed down the phone. "Don't be so dramatic, Nico. You'll be back in 6 months when you run out of money." My father was more direct. "You're throwing away your future over a bruised ego," he'd said. "This is a mistake, and you will regret it. But don't come crawling back to me when it fails." They thought it was a tantrum. They thought it was a bluff. They thought I was weak. They had no idea that their betrayal hadn't broken me. It had forged me into something cold and hard and patient. As I packed my last box, I made a promise to myself. I would not come crawling back. I would come back to own the ground they stood on. And now, as my plane begins its final descent, that promise is about to be kept. The first few weeks in Lisbon were a blur of cheap wine, rain-slicked cobblestones, and a profound, crushing loneliness. I had rented a small, sparsely furnished apartment in the Alfama district, with a single window that overlooked a tangle of terracotta roofs. For the first time in my life, I had no schedule, no conference calls, no cargo manifests to check. I was adrift. The initial shock of the betrayal had worn off, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. I'd walk for hours along the Tagus River, the scent of the sea, a constant reminder of the ocean that now separated me from everything I'd ever known. There were moments in the dead of night when the walls of that little apartment felt like they were closing in. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying that dinner over and over again in my mind. My father's dismissive wave of the hand, Clara's ecstatic, blind adoration for her snake of a husband, Julian's predatory smile. It was a film loop of humiliation. I'd feel the anger, white-hot and useless, followed by a wave of something colder and more terrifying, despair. Had my entire life been a waste? Had I poured 35 years of devotion into a vessel that was never meant for me? My father's words would echo in the silence. "You're throwing away your future over a bruised ego." For a few dark days, I almost believed him. I'd check flight prices back home, my finger hovering over the purchase button. The prodigal son, head bowed, ready to accept the scraps from the new king's table. But then I'd remember their faces, the smugness, the condescension, the absolute certainty that I was nothing without them, that my expertise was just a quaint little hobby they could transfer to a charlatan like Julian with a simple announcement. They hadn't just taken my job, they had tried to take my identity. They had looked at my life's work and declared it worthless. The despair didn't last. It couldn't. It began to curdle, to harden. The grief transmuted into something else entirely. It became resolve. A cold, clear, and diamond-hard purpose formed in the pit of my stomach. They thought I was a tantrum-throwing child. I would show them what a man with nothing left to lose could build. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to understand what the company was to me. It wasn't just a business, it was my entire world. I have these flashes of memory, more vivid than any photograph. I'm 10 years old, trailing my grandfather through the cacophony of the main warehouse. The air smells of cardboard, diesel, and coffee. He lifts me up onto a forklift, his big calloused hands guiding mine on the controls. "See, Nico," he'd rumble, "everything has its place. You just have to be smart enough to see the pattern." He wasn't just teaching me about Lysics, he was teaching me about life, order from chaos. That was his mantra. When I was in college studying business administration and supply chain management, I'd spend my summers working in every department. I loaded trucks on the midnight shift, my muscles screaming. I spent weeks in the customs brokerage office, learning the arcane regulations of a dozen different countries until my eyes burned. I saw the flaws, the inefficiencies that had crept in as my grandfather aged, and my father took over. My father, Dominic, was a brilliant salesman, but he hated the details. He saw the business as a stage for his personality, not as a complex machine that needed constant tuning. I remember my first big project. I was 24. We were losing money on our transatlantic routes because of slow turnaround times in European ports. My father wanted to solve it by throwing money at it, buying priority docking that didn't exist, greasing palms. It was his way, loud, expensive, and ineffective. I spent 3 months buried in data, mapping shipping lanes, port traffic, and ground transport networks. I found a pattern my grandfather would have loved. By diverting our ships to a smaller, less congested port in Antwerp and creating a dedicated trucking line to a central hub in Germany, we could cut 3 days off our delivery time and save 15% on port fees. I presented my plan to my father and the board. They were skeptical. It was too complex, too quiet. It didn't involve a splashy press release or a fancy dinner. But the numbers were undeniable. My father, seeing the potential savings, reluctantly gave me the green light. It worked better than I had even projected. It became the new standard, the Moretti method for European freight. It was my victory, my idea. But at the annual company gala, my father stood on stage and took all the credit. It took some bold, outside-the-box thinking, he'd boomed. But I knew we could crack the European nut. He didn't even mention my name. I was standing in the back of the room, and I just swallowed it. That was the price of being the engine, I told myself. The face of the company gets the glory. My time will come. I saw the same pattern with Julian. The man was a parasite. He'd suggest an idea in a meeting, an idea he'd overheard me discussing with an operations manager the day before. Because it came from him, from the charming outsider, my father and sister would praise its brilliance. "See, Nico, that's the kind of fresh perspective we need," Clara would say, giving Julian a proud look. I tried to warn her. I once showed her a report on a real estate venture Julian was pushing the family to invest in. The numbers were inflated, the projections pure fantasy. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Clara had just laughed. "Oh, Nico, you're just jealous. You can't stand that someone else has a good idea. Not everything is a spreadsheet." They invested. They lost $500,000. It was quietly swept under the rug, another of Julian's learning experiences, paid for by the profits my systems were generating. He was never held accountable. He was family. I, it seemed, was just staff. The catalyst that turned my resolve into a concrete plan came about 3 months after I landed in Lisbon. I was sitting in a small cafe, trying to teach myself Portuguese from a worn-out textbook, when my phone buzzed. It was an email from Clara. The subject line was simply, "Hope you're having fun." The tone was sickeningly sweet, dripping with condescension. She wrote about how well Julian was settling in, how he'd just landed a huge new client, a luxury fashion brand. "He's a natural," she wrote. "Everyone says it's like a breath of fresh air around the office. Daddy is so proud." At the end, she added a little barb, sharp and cruel. "Let us know if your adventure fund runs dry. I'm sure we could find a small consulting project for you." I felt the old anger rise, hot in my throat. I almost typed back a furious reply. But I stopped. I read the email again, and then I saw it. She wasn't just being cruel. She was being stupid. She named the client. A brand I knew well. I had tried to land their business for 2 years, but their logistics needs were incredibly complex and time-sensitive. They required a level of precision that Moretti Global, under my father's big-picture leadership, was ill-equipped to handle. Julian, a man who thought a bill of lading was a type of duck, couldn't possibly manage their account. He must have promised them the world, probably at a ridiculously low price to get them in the door. He was buying revenue, not earning profit. It was a premonition, a crack of lightning that illuminated the entire landscape. They weren't just going to fail, they were going to drive the company off a cliff with their arrogance and incompetence. and they would do it while mocking me for the very expertise that could have saved them. That was the moment. The anger cooled and settled into something far more dangerous, a strategy. I didn't reply to her email. I deleted it. I closed my textbook. I took out a fresh notebook and a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote navegar, the Portuguese word for to navigate. My grandfather taught me to find the pattern. My father taught me that the person who tells the best story wins. And Julian and Clara, they taught me that family is not always a fortress. Sometimes it's a cage. And I had just been handed the key. My little adventure was over. The war had just begun. My plan wasn't born from a single flash of inspiration. It was meticulously constructed, piece by piece, in that small Lisbon apartment that slowly transformed from a refuge into a war room. The first step was survival. I wasn't some trust fund kid. The money I had was my own savings, a respectable but finite amount. I couldn't afford to be idle. I needed to build, not just for revenge, but for my own future. I started small, consulting for local Portuguese businesses, companies too small for the big shipping conglomerates to notice. I used my expertise, the real-world, in-the-trenches knowledge my family had dismissed, to untangle their supply chain knots. I showed a small cork producer how to consolidate shipments to cut their costs by 30%. I helped a ceramics artisan navigate the labyrinth of U.S. import tariffs, opening up a market she never thought she could reach. My reputation grew by word of mouth. I wasn't Nico Moretti, the disgraced son. I was just Nico, the quiet guy who could look at a manifest and see the future. I was reliable, I was discreet, and most importantly, I was better and cheaper than the established players. My core insight was simple. The big logistics firms, like Moretti Global, were built on old models. They had massive overheads, legacy systems, and a rigid one-size-fits-all approach. They were dinosaurs. I was a mammal, small, fast, and adaptable. I built a proprietary software platform, coding late into the night, fueled by coffee and a burning desire to prove them wrong. It wasn't flashy, but it was brilliant. It integrated customs data, real-time freight tracking, and predictive analytics to find the most efficient route for any given shipment, automatically. It was the system I had always wanted to build at Moretti, but my father had scoffed at the investment. "We have people for that, Nico," he'd said. "We don't need fancy computers." Within a year, I had enough clients and a steady enough cash flow to officially incorporate Navigar Imports. I leased a small office space near the port and hired my first 2 employees, a sharp young Portuguese operations manager named Sofia and an old-school freight forwarder named Carlos who knew every customs agent in Europe by their first name. They didn't know my backstory, they just knew I was a demanding but fair boss who had an almost supernatural understanding of the business. It was around this time that I met Marco. I was in a dispute with a German freight company over a damaged shipment, and I needed legal advice. My new accountant recommended him. Marco was a Portuguese-American lawyer in his early 40s with a sharp suit, a sharper mind, and a weary look in his eyes that I recognized immediately. His office, unlike the opulent lairs of my father's corporate attorneys, was modest and functional. Books and case files were piled high, evidence of a man who did the work himself. Our first meeting was supposed to be 30 minutes. It lasted 3 hours. After we sorted out my legal issue, which he did with terrifying efficiency, we started talking. I told him a sanitized version of my story, that I'd left a family business in the States to strike out on my own. He listened intently, nodding. Then he told me his. He was locked in a bitter legal battle with his own cousins over his late uncle's small construction company in New Jersey. His uncle had promised it to him, the only one who'd ever shown an interest, but he'd died without updating his will. Now his cousins, who had openly mocked the business for years, were trying to liquidate it and cash out, destroying their uncle's legacy in the process. "It's not about the money," Marco said, swirling the ice in his glass of water. "It's the hypocrisy. They called him a glorified ditch digger his whole life. Now they want to dance on his grave for a payday." I saw a mirror of my own situation in his story. The same dismissal, the same entitled arrogance. We were 2 men cast out by families who couldn't see past their own greed. A bond formed between us that day, forged in the fires of mutual betrayal. Marco became more than my lawyer. He became my strategist, my confidant, my one-man board of directors. When I told him the full, unvarnished story of what had happened with my family, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered a plan. "They underestimated you, Nico," he said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "That's not an insult, it's an asset, the most powerful one you have." With Marco's legal guidance, we structured Navigar Imports to be a fortress. It was a Portuguese entity with a complex ownership structure, designed to be completely opaque to any casual inquiries from the US. My name was buried under layers of corporate filings. To the outside world, Navigar was just another ambitious European startup. We were a ghost. But being a ghost didn't mean we were silent. It meant we were watching. This was the second part of the plan, gathering intelligence. My revenge wouldn't be a crime of passion, it would be a cold, calculated execution based on perfect information. Marco, through his network of legal and financial contacts back in the States, became my periscope. He found a discreet private investigator, a former SEC enforcement agent, who began compiling a detailed dossier on Moretti Global's finances. Meanwhile, I reactivated my own old network. I reached out to a handful of people still at Moretti who I knew had been loyal to my grandfather's vision, not to my father's ego. I started with David, the head of IT, a brilliant guy my father always treated like a glorified repairman. I sent him a simple encrypted email. "Heard things have changed, hope you're well." He responded within an hour. He was miserable. Julian had brought in his own tech consultants, a bunch of slick 20-somethings who were replacing my robust, custom-built systems with expensive off-the-shelf software that barely worked. Morale was at an all-time low. David became my man on the inside. He never sent me proprietary documents, we were both too smart for that. But he would give me the color commentary, the details that don't show up in a financial report. He told me about Julian's disastrous attempt to expand into the Asian market without any due diligence, a venture that cost them millions in lost cargo and fines. He told me about the executive retreat to Bali, charged to the corporate card, while the company was missing payroll for its drivers. He told me how my father was becoming a recluse, delegating everything to Julian and refusing to listen to any warnings from his veteran staff. For 5 years, I built and I watched. Navigar imports grew exponentially. We expanded our operations into Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Valencia. We became known as the go-to firm for complex, time-sensitive logistics, the exact niche Moretti Global was now too incompetent to handle. I poured every cent of profit back into the company, into better technology, better people, better infrastructure. I lived frugally, my personal life taking a back seat to the mission. My little adventure was now a €50 million a year business with over 100 employees. And all the while, the reports from Marco and the intel from David painted a grim, predictable picture. Moretti Global was dying. They were leveraged to the hilt, bleeding cash, losing clients. Julian's rainmaking was a mirage. He was just giving away the farm, signing terrible deals to keep up the appearance of growth. They were a house of cards in a hurricane. I had their financials, their debt covenants, their client lists. I knew their vulnerabilities better than they did. I wasn't just waiting for them to fall. I was building the net to catch them. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place about 6 months ago. Marco's investigator sent me a file. Moretti Global had taken out a massive, high-interest bridge loan from a particularly ruthless private equity firm. It was a desperate move, a Hail Mary. I read the terms of the loan, and my pulse quickened. The collateral wasn't just the company's assets. It was my father's personal guarantees, including the family home, the vacation property, everything. He had bet the entire Moretti legacy on Julian, and the loan was due in 180 days. I looked at the calendar. It was time. The years of patient construction were over. It was time for demolition. I called Marco. "It's happening," I said. "They're about to default. Get ready." His reply was simple and chilling. "Nico, we've been ready for years." The first move had to be silent, precise, and devastating. It couldn't be a frontal assault. It had to be a scalpel, cutting a vital artery they wouldn't even know was bleeding until it was too late. I had been watching their client list for years, thanks to the information David fed me. I knew who their most profitable accounts were, and more importantly, I knew which ones were most likely to be unhappy with Julian's chaotic management. At the top of that list was a German luxury car manufacturer, a legacy client my grandfather had signed 40 years ago. They were notoriously demanding, and their just-in-time manufacturing process meant that a single delayed shipment of parts could shut down their entire assembly line, costing them millions per day. They were loyal, but they were not sentimental. I knew from David that Julian had been taking them for granted. He'd missed 2 key delivery windows in the last quarter, blaming European port strikes, a lie I could easily disprove. He'd also tried to raise their rates by 10% to cover his own financial blunders, a move that was met with fury by the Germans. They were primed to leave. They just needed a viable alternative, and I was about to give them one. I didn't just send them a proposal. That was my father's way. I sent them a demonstration. I spent a month setting it up, using Navigar's full logistical might. Through a cutout, a third-party logistics consultant Marco had on retainer, we approached the German company's head of procurement, a stern, no-nonsense man named Klaus Richter. We didn't mention Navigar. We didn't mention my name. The consultant simply said he represented a new, highly specialized firm that could solve their transatlantic shipping problems. Richter was skeptical, but he was also desperate. He agreed to a trial run. A single container of critical engine components, leaving their factory in Stuttgart, bound for their plant in South Carolina. Moretti Global's best ever time on this route was 12 days. I told the consultant to promise it in 9. Richter laughed. He said it was impossible. I knew it wasn't. The game was on. I personally oversaw every step. Our system routed the container not to the congested port of Hamburg, but south, to Trieste in Italy, a port Moretti never used. From there it was loaded onto a faster, smaller vessel that made fewer stops. My software tracked its progress in real time, adjusting for weather patterns and ocean currents. While it was at sea, our U.S. team, led by a brilliant manager I'd headhunted from a competitor, had already pre-cleared the shipment with customs. A truck was waiting at the port in Charleston the moment the container was offloaded. There was no waiting, no red tape, no delay. The container arrived at the South Carolina plant in 8 days and 14 hours, a full day ahead of our impossible promise, and nearly 4 days faster than Moretti Global's best. Richter was stunned. The next day, he demanded a call with the head of this mysterious new firm. That was my cue. I joined the video call from my office in Lisbon. I introduced myself as Nico, the CEO of Navigar Imports. I didn't use my last name. I didn't need to. I simply walked him through the data, showing him exactly how we'd done it, the efficiency of our model, the power of our technology. I then made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I would handle their entire transatlantic logistics portfolio, guarantee a 10-day delivery window on all shipments, and do it for 15% less than what they were currently paying Moretti Global. It wasn't a lowball offer, it was just the result of a vastly superior system. He was silent for a long moment. I could see him doing the math in his head. The savings, the reliability, the elimination of risk. Send me the contract, he said, his voice flat with the tone of a man who has just made an inevitable decision. The contract was signed within a week. The German company, representing nearly 20% of Moretti Global's annual revenue, terminated their agreement with my family's company, effective immediately. The artery was cut. The fallout was exactly as I had predicted. The news of the lost contract hit Moretti Global like a torpedo. David told me the atmosphere in the office went from anxious to funereal overnight. Losing a client is one thing. Losing a 4-decade-old legacy account to a complete unknown is a catastrophe. It sent a shockwave through the industry and, more importantly, through my family's already fragile finances. That lost revenue was the final straw that would trigger the default on their massive loan. Julian, of course, panicked. He flew into a rage, screaming at his staff, blaming everyone but himself. He tried to call Klaus Richter, but his calls weren't returned. He had no idea who Navigar Imports was or how they had done it. To him, we were a phantom that had materialized out of nowhere and stolen his crown jewel. He tried to counteroffer, promising to match our price, but it was too late. The trust was broken. He had been outmaneuvered by a superior player, and his only response was to flail. My father, Dominic, retreated even further into himself. According to David, he locked himself in his office for 2 days. When he emerged, he looked 10 years older. The weight of his catastrophic mistake of choosing the charmer over the craftsman was finally crashing down on him. But the most satisfying part of it all came in the form of an email from Clara. It arrived a week after the news broke. It was a mass email sent to a few dozen family and close friends, a transparent attempt to control the narrative. It was a masterpiece of self-pity and delusion. As some of you may have heard, she wrote, "We have been the target of a vicious and unethical attack by a new competitor. This shadowy European firm, using what we can only assume are predatory pricing tactics, has stolen a longtime client. It is a sad reflection on the state of business today, where loyalty and relationships mean nothing. Julian is handling the situation with incredible strength, and we know we will weather this storm. Please keep our family in your thoughts during this challenging time." She then added a personal note at the bottom, "Just for me. Nico, I know you're in that part of the world. Just a word of warning to be careful of these new cutthroat companies. They have no morals. It's a jungle out there. Hope your little import business is managing to stay safe." I read that last line, and I laughed. A deep, genuine, cathartic laugh. She was warning me about myself. They were so blinded by their arrogance, so secure in their belief that I was a failure, that the possibility of me being their shadowy competitor hadn't even entered their minds. Their underestimation of me wasn't just an asset anymore. It was a weapon, and I had just fired the first shot. They thought it was a storm. They had no idea it was an extinction-level event, and I was the meteor they never saw coming. The bankruptcy filing was inevitable. The loss of the German contract triggered a covenant breach in their loan agreement. The private equity firm, as ruthless as I knew they would be, called in the full amount immediately. My family had no way to pay. The house of cards collapsed. The official notice went out on a gray Monday morning. Moretti Global Logistics was insolvent. All assets would be liquidated in a court-supervised auction. This was the moment the second phase of my plan began. It was no longer about silent strategic cuts. It was time for a public dismantling. For 5 years, I had maintained a list. It was a list of names, the key people at Moretti Global who were not family, who were not sycophants, but who were the true heart and soul of the company. These were the people who, like me, had been marginalized and disrespected by Julian's regime. David, the brilliant IT head. Maria, the veteran chief accountant who had tried to warn my father about the company's finances and been told to stay in her lane. Frank, the warehouse operations manager who had worked for my grandfather and could choreograph the movement of 1,000 containers in his sleep. They were the institutional knowledge. They were the talent. They were the company. And I was about to rescue them. The day after the bankruptcy was announced, my personal assistant, Sophia, began making calls. One by one, she reached out to the people on my list. The offer was simple and direct. A position at Navigar Imports, in its newly forming North American division. A 20% salary increase over what they were making at Moretti. A generous signing bonus. And a guarantee that they would be working for a company that valued expertise over nepotism. The response was overwhelming. It was an exodus. David resigned the same day he got the offer, sending a 2-word email to Julian: "I quit." He spent his last 2 weeks of notice quietly forwarding all of his personal files and project notes to his private email. He was now Navigar's new chief technology officer. Maria, the accountant, wept with relief on the phone with Sophia. She accepted immediately. She walked into Julian's office, placed her keys on his desk, and told him she could no longer be complicit in his financial malpractice. Frank, the warehouse manager, gathered his team of foremen, told them about the offer, and they all walked out together. Within 72 hours, I had gutted Moretti Global of its entire operational brain trust. It was a crippling blow, far more damaging than the loss of any single client. Without these people, any hope my family had of buying back the company's assets and restarting under a new name was a fantasy. They could buy the trucks, the warehouses, the brand name, but they couldn't buy the talent, because the talent now worked for me. The news of the mass defections finally pierced the thick veil of my family's denial. The phantom competitor suddenly had a face. Marco's sources told him the scene was apoplectic. My father, apparently, had thrown a lamp across his study. Julian had tried to threaten David with a lawsuit for poaching, a pathetic gesture that Marco's legal team swatted down before it even got started. And then the calls began, the desperate attempts at counter-manipulation. The first was from my mother, Isabella. Her number flashed on my screen, a number I hadn't seen in 5 years. I let it ring, then listened to the voicemail. Her voice was thick with manufactured tears, a performance of wounded motherhood I knew all too well. "Nico, darling," she cooed. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm hearing these terrible rumors. People are saying you're involved in this. Whatever is happening, you can't turn your back on your family. Your father is devastated. We love you. Please, just call me. We can fix this." It was a masterclass in guilt, an attempt to reframe my calculated strategy as a childish spat that could be fixed with a hug and an apology. I deleted the message without a second thought. The next came from my father. Not a call, but an email. It was a stark contrast to my mother's soft approach. It was pure, distilled rage and entitlement. "I know what you are doing," it began, with no salutation. "You will cease and desist immediately. This is a malicious and targeted attack on your own blood. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? By trying to destroy my life's work? Whatever fantasy of revenge you are playing out, it ends now. You are still a Moretti, and you will show this family the respect it deserves." Respect. The word was so audacious, so completely devoid of self-awareness, that I had to admire the sheer gall of it. He was the king, even in his ruin, demanding fealty from the exile he had created. I forwarded the email to Marco with a single note. For the file. The final communication came from Clara, a long, rambling text message that toggled between fury and pleading. "How could you do this to us, Nico?" "To me? Julian is a good man. He was doing his best. You're just bitter. You've been bitter your whole life because you were never the favorite. This is sick. You're destroying our family because you couldn't get over a promotion. Are you happy now, seeing us suffer? Daddy is broken. You did this. You need to stop. Call them back. Tell your people to refuse the offers. It's not too late to undo this. It's not too late." That was the line that stuck with me. The profound, unshakable belief that they still held the power. That I was just a pawn they could command. That a few well-placed words could reverse 5 years of meticulous planning. They still didn't get it. They didn't understand that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been inverted. They weren't in a position to make demands. They were shipwrecked survivors clinging to a piece of driftwood, trying to command the tide. And I was the tide. I didn't reply to any of them. Silence was a weapon they had used against me for years, ignoring my contributions, dismissing my warnings. Now I was wielding it back at them. Every unanswered call, every unread email, was a testament to their powerlessness. The family that had defined my entire existence was now screaming into a void, and I was the one who had created it. The family exodus, as Marco had started calling it, was complete. The stage was set for the final act. All that was left was the trip home. The day of the auction was a perfect autumn day. The sky was a crisp, brilliant blue, and the air had a slight chill that felt foreign and invigorating, after 5 years of Lisbon's mild climate. I didn't go to the family home. I had no interest in seeing it. Marco had booked me a suite at a sleek, modern hotel downtown, a place that felt like it belonged to my new life, not my old one. From my window I could see the top of the Moretti Global building, a monument to my father's ego that would soon have a new owner. I dressed carefully that morning, not in a flashy suit like Julian would wear, but in a simple, perfectly tailored dark gray suit, a white shirt, and no tie. It was the uniform of a man who was there for business, not for show. It was a look of quiet, unshakable confidence. Marco met me in the lobby, along with David and Maria, my new CTO and CFO. They weren't just there for support, they were there as a symbol, the living embodiment of the brain drain that had crippled my family's company. Their presence was a strategic move, a visual confirmation of who now held all the cards. We took a black-towned car to the auction house, a grand old building with marble columns and an air of solemn importance. As we walked up the steps, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger that had fueled me for so long had burned away, leaving only a cold, clear purpose. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about closing a transaction. The auction was being held in a large wood-paneled room. It was filled with lawyers in gray suits and vulture investors who smelled blood in the water. And then I saw them. My family. They were huddled together in the front row, a small island of crumbling dynasty. My father looked diminished. The booming, confident patriarch was gone, replaced by a stooped old man in an ill-fitting suit. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room with a hunted expression. My mother was beside him, her face a tight mask of tragedy, clutching his arm as if to hold him up. Clara stood slightly behind them, her arms crossed, her face a thunderous scowl of pure venom. And Julian. He was trying to project an air of nonchalance, whispering to their lawyer, but his jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching from across the room. They hadn't seen us yet. We took our seats in the third row, directly behind them. The court-appointed liquidator, a balding man with tired eyes, walked to the podium and began the proceedings. He droned on about the terms of the sale, the lot numbers, the asset lists. I wasn't listening. I was watching the back of my father's head. Then Clara turned. She was scanning the room, probably looking for competitors, and her eyes swept over our row. They passed over me at first, not registering. Then they snapped back. Her mouth fell open. A small, strangled gasp escaped her lips. She grabbed Julian's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. He turned, annoyed, and followed her gaze. His face went from confusion to disbelief, to pure, unadulterated shock in the space of 3 seconds. He looked like he'd seen a ghost in a very expensive suit. One by one, they all turned. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father, he slowly turned his head, and his eyes met mine. In that single moment, all the years of denial, of condescension, of willful ignorance, evaporated. He finally understood. Everything, the lost client, the mass resignations, the shadowy European firm. It was all me. The prodigal son hadn't come back to beg. He had come back to conquer. The bidding began. The lot was for the entire company, the name, the client lists, the physical assets, the real estate, everything. My family's lawyer, looking shaken, made the opening bid. It was a lowball number, a desperate attempt to start the process. A few of the vulture investors made half-hearted counterbids, but they dropped out quickly. They knew my family was desperate and would likely overpay. This was their show. They were bidding against themselves, scraping together the last of their credit and dignity to buy back their name. Julian was the one calling out the numbers, his voice tight and strained, each bid higher than the last. They were fighting for their lives. I let them sweat. I let them believe they might actually have a chance. Marco put a hand on my arm, a silent instruction to wait. We waited until the liquidator had called their final bid twice. Going once, going twice. 150 million, I said. My voice was calm, clear, and loud enough to carry through the entire room. A collective gasp went through the hall. The figure was more than double my family's last bid. It was an overwhelming, crushing show of force. It was a number they could not possibly match. Julian whipped his head around, his face white with fury and disbelief. "You can't do that," he sputtered, half rising from his seat. The liquidator banged his gavel. The gentleman is recognized. The bid is 150 million. Do I have any other bids? The room was silent. My family's lawyer was frantically whispering to my father, who just sat there, staring into space, a broken man. Julian looked at him, pleading. Dad. Dominic. Do something. But there was nothing to do. It was over. Going once, the liquidator called out, looking directly at their row. Going twice. He paused, letting the finality of the moment sink in. Sold. To the bidder in the third row. The gavel came down with a sharp final crack. The sound echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of my old world ending and my new one beginning. I stood up. Flanked by Marco, David, and Maria, I walked to the front of the room. I didn't go to the podium. I walked directly to where my family sat, frozen in their seats. I stopped in front of them, looking down at the architects of my exile. Julian glared at me, his fists clenched. You son of a... He started, but Clara put a hand on his arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hate. I looked past them, directly at my father. He finally lifted his head, and in his eyes I saw not anger, but a vast empty chasm of defeat. Hello, Father, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. You told me not to come crawling back. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I'm here to collect the keys. I turned to Julian. As the new owner of this company's assets, my first official act is to inform you that your services are no longer required. You have 1 hour to clear your personal effects from the executive office. Security will escort you. His face turned a blotchy red, but he was speechless. He was nothing now, a king without a kingdom. Finally, I looked at my sister Clara, the smug, condescending woman who had mocked my little adventure. She was staring at me as if I were a monster. I hope you enjoy the life you chose, Clara, I said softly, and then I turned my back on them. I walked away, leaving them sitting in the ruins. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The debt was paid. The ledger was balanced. The quiet crack from that dinner table 5 years ago had been sealed, not with forgiveness, but with absolute, undeniable victory. The aftermath was exactly as I had planned, swift and total. The name Moretti Global Logistics ceased to exist the following day. I had no interest in preserving a legacy of incompetence. The best of its assets, the trucks, the warehouses, the infrastructure, were absorbed into Navigar Imports' new North American division. The gaudy, inefficient corporate headquarters my father had built as a monument to himself was the first thing I put on the market. It sold within a month to a tech company that promptly gutted the marble lobby and replaced the oil paintings of my ancestors with ping-pong tables. I found a certain poetry in that. My first priority was the people. I personally met with all the former Moretti employees who had been laid off, the ones left behind by my family's mismanagement. I rehired over 200 of them, from drivers to dock workers to administrative staff. The look of relief on their faces, the renewed sense of hope and security that was a victory more satisfying than the auction itself. I had not just bought a company. I had saved a community from the carelessness of my own family. My new team, led by the veterans I'd rescued like David and Maria, hit the ground running. We implemented Navigar's technology and methods, and within 6 months, the North American division was not only stable but highly profitable. We were doing what Moretti Global was supposed to do, only better, faster, and smarter. As for my family, their fall was as complete as my rise. The 150 million from the auction went directly to the private equity firm and their other creditors. There was nothing left. They lost everything. The sprawling family home I grew up in was seized and sold. The vacation house in the Hamptons, the fleet of luxury cars, the country club memberships, all gone. My father, the proud patriarch, was reduced to living in a small rented condo, a bitter, broken man with nothing but his memories of a kingdom he had willingly handed to a fool. The social humiliation was, perhaps even worse. The story of the upstart son returning from exile to buy out his family's company became a legend in business circles. They became a cautionary tale, a punchline at the very galas and charity events where they once held court. Julian and Clara's marriage, which was built on a foundation of ambition and money, crumbled without it. Marco's sources told me the arguments were epic, the recriminations endless. He blamed her family for being weak. She blamed him for his incompetence. He couldn't find work. His reputation as a rainmaker was a joke. They separated within a year, and their divorce was as bitter and pathetic as their reign had been. Last I heard, Julian was selling high-end kitchen appliances, living off commissions, and Clara had moved to a small town somewhere in the Midwest, trying to escape the shadow of the family name she had once been so proud of. I never spoke to any of them again. I had nothing left to say. My mother tried to reach out a few more times, sending long, rambling letters about the importance of blood and the tragedy of it all. I never read them. My revenge was never about shouting, it was about building. It was about proving that competence is the ultimate currency, that hard work is worth more than a family name, and that true vision isn't about flashy sales pitches. It's about seeing the pattern when no one else can. So now, here I am. I'm back in my office in Lisbon, looking out over the harbor. The sun is setting, casting a golden glow over the water. My company is thriving on 2 continents. I have a team I respect and who respects me. I have built a life of my own making, on my own terms. The anger is gone, the bitterness has faded. All that's left is a quiet, profound sense of peace. I didn't set out to destroy my family. I set out to build a better version of what they had, and their own arrogance and hubris simply couldn't compete. They created the storm that sank their own ship. I was just the rock they broke themselves against. So if you're out there, and you feel like you've been cast aside, underestimated, or told that your contribution doesn't matter, let me tell you this. Don't get angry. Get strategic. Don't get even. Get ahead. Use their dismissal as your shield and their ignorance as your sword. Build your own empire brick by patient brick, and one day you'll look up and realize you've built it on the ground where their castle used to stand. Thanks for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, let me know your own experiences in the comments below. I read them all. And if you want to hear more stories about karmic justice and the underdog getting their due, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know whose story you might hear next.